Chapter 36 of the Wide, Wide World. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget. The Wide, Wide World by Susan Warner. Chapter 36 The Brownie. In the course of time, Miss Fortune showed signs of mending, and at last, towards the latter end of April, she was able to come down stairs. All parties hailed this event, for different reasons. Even Nancy was growing tired of her regular life, and willing to have a change. Ellen's joy was, however, soon diminished by the terrible rummaging which took place. Miss Fortune's hands were yet obliged to lie still, but her eyes did double duty. They were never known to be idle in the best of times, and it seemed to Ellen now as if they were taking amends for all their weeks of forced rest. Oh, those eyes! Dust was found where Ellen never dreamed of looking for any. Things were said to be dreadfully in the way where she had never found it out. Disorder and dirt were groaned over where Ellen did not know the fact, or was utterly ignorant how to help it. Waste was suspected where none had been, and carelessness charged where rather praise was due. Impatient to have things to her mind, and as yet unable to do anything herself, Miss Fortune kept Nancy and Ellen running, till both wished her back in bed, and even Mr. Van Brunt grumbled, that, to pay Ellen for having grown white and poor, her aunt was going to work the little flesh she had off her bones. It was rather hard to bear, just when she was looking for ease too. Her patience and temper were more tried than in all those weeks before. But if there was small pleasure in pleasing her aunt, Ellen did earnestly wish to please God. She struggled against ill temper, prayed against it, and, though she often blamed herself in secret, she did so go through that week as to call forth Mr. Van Brunt's admiration, and even to stir a little the conscience of her aunt. Mr. Van Brunt comforted her with the remark, that "it is darkest just before day," and so it proved. Before the week was at an end, Miss Fortune began, as she expressed it, to take hold. Jenny Hitchcock and Jane Huff were excused from any more butter making; Nancy was sent away; Ellen's labours were much lightened; and the house was itself again. The 3rd of May came. For the first time in near 2 months, Ellen found in the afternoon she could be spared a while. There was no need to think twice what she would do with her leisure. Perhaps Margery could tell her something of Alice. Hastily and joyfully she exchanged her working frock for a merino, put on nice shoes and stockings, and ruffle again, and taking her bonnet and gloves to put on out of doors, away she ran. Who can tell how pleasant it seemed, after so many weeks, to be able to walk abroad again, and to walk to the mountain? Ellen snuffed the sweet air, skipped on the green sward, picked nosegays of grass and dandelions, and at last, unable to contain herself, set off to run. Fatigue soon brought this to a stop; then she walked more leisurely on, enjoying. It was a lovely spring day. Ellen's eyes were gladdened by it. She felt thankful in her heart that God had made everything so beautiful. She thought it was pleasant to think He had made them; pleasant to see in them everywhere so much of the wisdom and power and goodness of Him she looked up to with joy as her best friend. She felt quietly happy, and sure He would take care of her. Then a thought of Alice came into her head. She set off to run again, and kept it up this time till she got to the old house, and ran round the corner. She stopped at the shed door, and went through into the lower kitchen. "Why, Miss Ellen, dear!" exclaimed Margery, "if that isn't you! Aren't you come in the very nick of time? How do you do? I am very glad to see you uncommon glad, to be sure. What witch told you to come here just now? Run into the parlour, and see what you'll find there." "Has Alice come back?" cried Ellen; but Margery only laughed, and said, "Run in." Up the steps, through the kitchen, and across the hall, Ellen ran, burst open the parlour door, and was in Alice's arms. There were others in the room, but Ellen did not seem to know it, clinging to her, and holding her in a fast, glad embrace, till Alice bade her look up and attend to somebody else. And then she was seized around the neck by little Ellen Chauncey, and then came her mother, and then Miss Sophia. The two children were overjoyed to see each other, while their joy was touching to see, from the shade of sorrow in the one, and of sympathy in the other. Ellen was scarcely less glad to see kind Mrs. Chauncey. Miss Sophia's greeting, too, was very affectionate; but Ellen returned to Alice, and resting herself in her lap, with one arm round her neck, the other hand being in little Ellen's grasp. "And now you are happy, I suppose?" said Miss Sophia, when they were thus placed. "Very," said Ellen, smiling. "Ah, but you'll be happier by and by," said Ellen Chauncey. "Hush, Ellen," said Miss Sophia; "what curious things children are! You didn't expect to find us all here, did you, Ellen Montgomery?" "No, indeed, Ma'am," said Ellen, drawing Alice's cheek nearer for another kiss. "We have but just come, Ellie," said her sister. "I should not have been long in finding you out. My child, how thin you have got!" "Oh, I'll grow fat again now," said Ellen. "How is Miss Fortune?" "Oh, she is up again and well." "Have you any reason to expect your father home, Ellen?" said Mrs. Chauncey. "Yes, Ma'am. Aunt Fortune says perhaps he will be here in a week." "Then you are very happy and looking forward, aren't you?" said Miss Sophia, not noticing the cloud that had come over Ellen's brow. Ellen hesitated, coloured more, and finally, with a sudden motion, hid her face against Alice. "When did he sail, Ellie?" said Alice, gravely. "In the Duc d'Orleans. He said he would." "When?" "The 5th of April. Oh, I can't help it!" exclaimed Ellen, failing in the effort to control herself. She clasped Alice as if she feared even then the separating hand. Alice bent her head down, and whispered words of comfort. "Mamma," said little Ellen Chauncey, under her breath, and looking solemn to the last degree, "don't Ellen want to see her father?" "She's afraid that he may take her away where she will not be with Alice any more; and you know she has no mother to go to." "Oh," said Ellen, with a very enlightened face, "but he won't, will he?" "I hope not I think not." Cheered again, the little girl drew near, and silently took one of Ellen's hands. "We shall not be parted, Ellie," said Alice; "you need not fear. If your father takes you away from your Aunt Fortune, I think it will be only to give you to me. You need not fear yet." "Mamma says so too, Ellen," said her little friend. This was a strong consolation. Ellen looked up and smiled. "Now come with me," said Ellen Chauncey, pulling her hand. "I want you to show me something. Let's go down to the garden come. Exercise is good for you." "No, no," said her mother, smiling. "Ellen has had exercise enough lately. You mustn't take her down to the garden now. You would find nothing there. Come here." A long whisper followed, which seemed to satisfy little Ellen, and she ran out of the room. Some time passed in pleasant talk, in telling all that had happened since they had seen each other. Then little Ellen came back and called Ellen Montgomery to the glass door, saying she wanted her to look at something. "It is only a horse we brought with us," said Miss Sophia. "Ellen thinks it is a great beauty, and can't rest till you have seen it." Ellen went accordingly to the door. There, to be sure, was Thomas before it, holding a pony bridled and saddled. He was certainly a very pretty little creature, brown all over except for one white forefoot; his coat shone, it was so glossy; his limbs were fine; his eye gentle and bright; his tail long enough to please the children. He stood as quiet as a lamb, whether Thomas held him or not. "Oh, what a beauty!" said Ellen; "what a lovely little horse!" "Ain't he?" said Ellen Chauncey; "and he goes so beautifully besides, and never starts nor nothing; and he is as good natured as a little dog." "As a good natured little dog, she means, Ellen," said Miss Sophia; "there are little dogs of very various character." "Well, he looks good natured," said Ellen. "What a pretty head! and what a beautiful new side saddle, and all! I never saw such a dear little horse in my life. Is it yours, Alice?" "No," said Alice; "it is a present to a friend of Mr. Marshman's." "She'll be a very happy friend, I should think," said Ellen. "That's what I said," said Ellen Chauncey, dancing up and down "that's what I said. I said you'd be happier by and by, didn't I?" "I?" said Ellen, colouring. "Yes, you you are the friend it is for. It's for you it's for you. You are grandpa's friend, aren't you?" she repeated, springing upon Ellen, and hugging her up in an ecstasy of delight. "But it isn't really for me, is it?" said Ellen, now looking almost pale. "Oh, Alice!" "Come, come," said Miss Sophia; "what will papa say if I tell him you received his present so? Come, hold up your head. Put on your bonnet and try him. Come, Ellen, let's see you." Ellen did not know whether to cry or laugh, till she mounted the pretty pony. That settled the matter. Not Ellen Chauncey's unspeakable delight was as great as her own. She rode slowly up and down before the house, and once a going, would not have known how to stop if she had not recollected that the pony had travelled 30 miles that day, and must be tired. Ellen begged not another turn after that. She jumped down and begged Thomas to take the tenderest care of him, patted his neck, ran into the kitchen to beg of Margery a piece of bread to give him from her hand, examined the new stirrup and housings, and the pony all over a dozen times, and after watching him as Thomas led him off, till he was out of sight, finally came back into the house, with a face of marvellous contentment. She tried to fashion some message of thanks for the kind giver of the pony, but she wanted to express so much that no words would do. Miss Chauncey, however, smiled, and assured her she knew exactly what to say. "That pony has been destined for you, Ellen," she said, "this year and more; but my father waited to have him thoroughly well broken. You need not be afraid of him. He is perfectly gentle and well trained. If he had not been sure of that, my father would not have sent him, though Mr. John is making such a horsewoman of you." "I wish I could thank him," said Ellen, "but I don't know how." "What will you call him, Ellen?" said Miss Sophia. "My father has dubbed him George Marshman. He says you will like that, as my brother is such a favourite of yours." "He didn't really, did he?" said Ellen, looking from Sophia to Alice. "I needn't call him that, need I?" "Not unless you like," said Miss Sophia, laughing. "You may change it. But what will you call him?" "I don't know," said Ellen, very gravely. "He must have a name, to be sure." "But why don't you call him that?" said Ellen Chauncey. "George is a very pretty name. I like that. I should call him Uncle George." "Oh, I couldn't," said Ellen; "I couldn't call him so. I shouldn't like it at all." "George Washington?" said Mrs. Chauncey. "No, indeed," said Ellen; "I guess I wouldn't." "Why? Is it too good, or not good enough?" said Miss Sophia. "Too good a great deal too good for a horse. I wouldn't for anything." "How would Brandywine do, then, since you are so patriotic?" said Miss Sophia, looking amused. "What is patriotic?" said Ellen. "A patriot, Ellen," said Alice, smiling, "is one who has a strong and true love for his country." "I don't know whether I am patriotic," said Ellen, "but I won't call him Brandywine." "Why, Miss Sophia?" "No, I wouldn't either," said Ellen Chauncey; "it isn't a pretty name. Call him Seraphine, like Miss Angel's pony. That's pretty." "No, no, Seraphine, nonsense!" said Miss Sophia. "Call him Benedict Arnold, Ellen, and then it will be a relief to your mind to whip him." "Whip him!" said Ellen. "I don't want to whip him, I am sure; and I should be afraid to, besides." "Hasn't John taught you that lesson yet?" said the young lady. "He is perfect in it himself. Do you remember, Alice, the chastising he gave that fine black horse of ours we called the Black Prince? A beautiful creature he was more than a year ago? My conscience! he frightened me to death." "I remember," said Alice; "I remember I could not look on." "What did he do that for?" said Ellen. "What's the matter, Ellen Montgomery?" said Miss Sophia, laughing. "Where did you get that long face? Are you thinking of John or the horse?" Ellen's eyes turned to Alice. "My dear Ellen," said Alice, smiling, though she spoke seriously, "it was necessary it sometimes is necessary to do such things. You do not suppose John would do it cruelly or unnecessarily?" Ellen's face shortened considerably. "But what had the horse been doing?" "He had not been doing anything he would not do that was the trouble. He was as obstinate as a mule." "My dear Ellen," said Alice, "it was no such terrible matter as Sophia's words have made you believe. It was a clear case of obstinacy. The horse was resolved to have his own way, and not do what his rider required of him. It was necessary that either the horse or the man should give up; and as John has no fancy for giving up, he carried his point, partly by management, partly, I confess, by judicious use of the whip and spur; but there was no such furious flagellation as Sophia seems to mean, and which a good horseman would scarce be guilty of." "A very determined use," said Miss Sophia. "I advise you, Ellen, not to trust your pony to Mr. John; he will have no mercy on him." "Sophia is laughing, Ellen," said Alice. "You and I know John, do we not?" "Then he did right?" said Ellen. "Perfectly right except in mounting the horse at all, which I never wished him to do. No one on the place would ride him." "He carried John beautifully all the day after that, though," said Miss Sophia; "and I dare say he might have ridden him to the end of the chapter if you would have let Papa give him to him. But he was of no use to anybody else. Howard couldn't manage him; I suppose he was too lazy. Papa was delighted enough that day to have given John anything; and I can tell you, Black Prince the second is spirited enough. I'm afraid you won't like him." "John has a present of a horse, too, Ellen," said Alice. "Has he? from Mr. Marshman?" "Yes." "I'm very glad. Oh, what rides we can take now, can't we, Alice? We shan't want to borrow Jenny's pony any more. What kind of a horse is Mr. John's?" "Black perfectly black." "Is he handsome?" "Very." "Is his name Black Prince?" "Yes." Ellen began to consider the possibility of calling her pony the Brown Princess, or by some similar title, the name of John's two chargers seeming the very most striking a horse could be known by. "Don't forget, Alice," said Mrs. Chauncey, "to tell John to stop for him on his way home. It will give us a chance of seeing him, which is not a common pleasure, in any sense of the term." They went back to the subject of the name, which Ellen pondered with uneasy visions of John and her poor pony flitting through her head. The little horse was very hard to fit. or else Ellen's taste was very hard to suit. A great many names were proposed, none of which were to her mind Charlie, and Cherry, and Brown, and Dash, and Jumper; but she said they had John and Jenny already in Thirlwall, and she didn't want a Charlie. Brown was not pretty, and she hoped he wouldn't dash at anything, nor be a jumper when she was on his back. Cherry she mused a while about, but it wouldn't do. "Call him Fairy," said Ellen Chauncey; "that's a pretty name. Mamma says she used to have a horse called Fairy. Do, Ellen, call him Fairy." "No," said Ellen, "he can't have a lady's name that's the trouble." "I have it, Ellen," said Alice; "I have a name for you. Call him the Brownie." "The Brownie?" said Ellen. "Yes; brownies are male fairies, and brown is his colour; so how will that do?" It was soon decided that it would do very well. It was simple, descriptive, and not common. Ellen made up her mind that the Brownie should be his name. No sooner given, it began to grow dear. Ellen's face quitted its look of anxious gravity, and came out into the broadest and fullest satisfaction. She never showed joy boisterously, but there was a light in her eye which brought many a smile into those of her friends as they sat round the tea table. After tea it was necessary to go home, much to the sorrow of all parties. Ellen knew, however, it would not do to stay. Miss Fortune was but just got well, and perhaps already thinking herself ill used. She put on her things. "Are you going to take your pony home with you?" said Miss Sophia. "Oh, no, Maam, not to night. I must see about a place for him; and besides, poor fellow, he is tired, I dare say." "I do believe you would take more care of his legs than of your own," said Miss Sophia. "But you'll be here to morrow early, Ellie." "Oh, won't I!" exclaimed Ellen, as she sprang to Alice's neck; "as early as I can; at least, I don't know when Aunt Fortune will have done with me." The way home seemed as nothing; if she was tired she did not know it. The Brownie! the Brownie! the thought of him carried her as cleverly over the ground as his very back would have done. She came running into the chip yard. "Hollo!" cried Mr. Van Brunt, who was standing under the apple tree, cutting a piece of wood for the tongue of the ox cart, which had been broken. "I'm glad to see you can run. I was afeard you'd hardly be able to stand by this time; but there you come like a young deer." "Oh, Mr. Van Brunt," said Ellen, coming up close to him, and speaking in an undertone, "you don't know what a present I have had. What do you think? Mr. Marshman has sent me from Ventnor." "Couldn't guess," said Mr. Van Brunt, resting the end of his pole on the log, and chipping at it with his hatchet; "never guessed anything in my life. What is it?" "He has sent me the most beautiful little horse you ever saw, for my own, for me to ride; and a beautiful saddle and bridle. You never saw anything so beautiful, Mr. Van Brunt. He is all brown, with one white forefoot, and I've named him the Brownie. And oh, Mr. Van Brunt, do you think Aunt Fortune will let him come here?" Mr. Van Brunt chipped away at his pole, looking very good humoured. "Because you know I couldn't have half the good of him if he had to stay away from me up on the mountain. I shall want to ride him every day. Do you think Aunt Fortune will let him be kept here, Mr. Van Brunt?" "I guess she will," said Mr. Van Brunt, soberly; and his tone said to Ellen, "I will, if she don't." "Then will you ask her and see about it, if you please, Mr. Van Brunt? I'd rather you would. And you won't have him put to plough or anything, will you, Mr. Van Brunt? Miss Sophia says it would spoil him." "I'll plough myself first," said Mr. Van Brunt, with his half smile; "there shan't be a hair of his coat turned the wrong way. I'll see to him as if he was a prince." "Oh, thank you, dear Mr. Van Brunt; how good you are! Then I shall not speak about him at all till you do, remember. I am very much obliged to you, Mr. Van Brunt." Ellen ran in. She got a chiding for her long stay, but it fell upon ears that could not hear. The Brownie came like a shield between her and all trouble. She smiled at her aunt's hard words as if they had been sugar plums. And her sleep that night might have been prairie land, for the multitude of horses of all sorts that chased through it. "Have you heerd the news?" said Mr. Van Brunt, when he had got his second cup of coffee at breakfast next morning. "No," said Miss Fortune. "What news?" "There ain't as much news as there used to be when I was young," said the old lady. "Seems to me I don't hear nothing now a days." "You might if you'd keep your ears open, mother. What news, Mr. Van Brunt?" "Why, here's Ellen got a splendid little horse sent her a present from some of her great friends, Mr. Marshchalk." "Mr. Marshman," said Ellen. "Mr. Marshman. There ain't the like in the country, as I've heerd tell; and I expect next thing she'll be flying all over the fields and fences like smoke." There was a meaning silence. Ellen's heart beat. "What's going to be done with him, do you suppose?" said Miss Fortune. Her look said, "If you think I am coming round, you are mistaken." "Humph!" said Mr. Van Brunt, slowly; "I suppose he'll eat grass in the meadow, and there'll be a place fixed for him in the stables." "Not in my stables," said the lady, shortly. "No, in mine," said Mr. Van Brunt, half smiling; "and I'll settle with you about it by and by, when we square up our accounts." Miss Fortune was very much vexed, Ellen could see that; but she said no more, good or bad, about the matter; so the Brownie was allowed to take quiet possession of meadow and stables, to his mistress's unbounded joy. Anybody that knew Mr. Van Brunt would have been surprised to hear what he said that morning, for he was thought to be quite as keen a looker after the main chance as Miss Fortune herself; only somehow it was never laid against him as it was against her. However that might be, it was plain he took pleasure in keeping his word about the pony. Ellen herself couldn't have asked for more carefulness for her favourite than the Brownie had from every man and boy about the farm. CHAPTER XXXVII.